The State Department's U.S. Diplomacy Center Pavilion opened in January of 2017. The center uses programs, exhibits, and artifacts to educate the public about diplomacy, and they plan to eventually open a museum at the location. Up next, we visit the center's collection storage area to see some of their 7,000 artifacts.
So there have been a lot of homes of the Department of State, and they've moved around a lot.
Quite a bit.
And from different cities as well, not just in
Right.
Washington, D.C.
So Washington was not the original capital of the United States. The first capital was in New York City. The Department of State is the oldest cabinet agency that was established, and Thomas Jefferson was our first Secretary of State. George Washington formally asked him to be Secretary of State. He was in France at the time, but agreed. And so the first home was in New York, and then shortly afterwards it moved to Philadelphia in 1790, and it was there for about 10 years until all the federal offices moved then to Washington, D.C. And so the Department of State, very small, but they had there was no home really permanently for them until 1819, when a brick structure was built flanking the White House, and it was at 15th Street. And that was the home of the Department of State for a number of years, from 1819. John Quincy Adams was the first secretary to occupy that space. And the last secretary to occupy it was William Seward. Right after the Civil War, it was determined that it was just too small, that they needed a much bigger building. And so that building was demolished, and the building put in its place is the current, what we call, the old Executive Office building.
Right.
But in 1875, it was the new Executive Office building. And so State remained there for a very long time. Until it was determined once again just too small for the needs, mostly because of World War II. And we realized we needed not only embassies overseas, we needed consulates, we needed more protection for American citizens. And so it was determined that the Foggy Bottom location was going to be the now permanent home of the Department of State.
But no sooner did they move into Foggy Bottom.
Right. Well,
Then
it wasn't their original home either. The
Right.
building was built for the War Department in 1940. And one of the really cool things about the Diplomacy Center when visitors go in, it's physically attached to that old exterior of the 1940 building.
The old war
The
building.
old war building. So you can see there's the cornerstone with Franklin Roosevelt's name on it in 1940. And then the War Department became the Department of Defense. We need more room.
And the Pentagon.
So the Pentagon was built. And so in 1947 is when the Department of State moved into that building, and George C. Marshall was the first Secretary of State. And so when visitors come in, they'll be able to see the historic lobby where we have a really very interesting mural painted by Kindred McLeary that very much kind of shows the War Department in a way.
Yeah, the legacy of the
The
building.
legacy, exactly. So let's talk a little bit, Ben, about the further expansion.
Right. So they weren't there for more than 10 years?
10 odd years.
Before they realized that they
1950s,
needed a lot more space.
Right.
And so plans were made to significantly expand the building to what we know today, which borders 21st Street and 23rd Street, as well as C Street and D Street. And so there was a cornerstone laying ceremony in 1957.
Yes, presided over by none other than President Eisenhower. And so one of the really interesting things that we uncovered when we were learning about this is when Eisenhower laid the cornerstone of the building, he used the trowel that had been used by George Washington to lay the cornerstone of the U.S. Capitol. And they also put in some historical documents in the cornerstone at the time. And then during the Kennedy administration, well, actually right before Kennedy was inaugurated, there was another expansion. And this is where we really get the modern State Department, where we have the official entrance on C Street. So the Diplomacy Center is at 21st Street, and that's where the old War Building State Department entrance was. But C Street is the diplomatic entrance.
Exactly. And so they celebrated the dedication and opening of this new expansion on January 5th, 1961. So it was actually a relatively quick construction. From 1957 to 1961, they significantly expanded the office space of the building. And so we have the dedication program. There was much fanfare with marine bands and
It was a
tours
hoopla,
of the building. And so we have then the modern, what we know today is the modern building. And so this booklet was created to I guess, advertise and celebrate, the new home, as it says here inside, the new home of American diplomacy. And one interesting historical fact about this new building, as you said, it was at the beginning of the Kennedy administration, and President Kennedy would actually hold press conferences at the Department of State's auditorium, what is now called the Dean Acheson Auditorium. And so this booklet explains a bit of the history and use of the building.
Yes, Ms. Lee.
Under what conditions would you consider reopening diplomatic relations with Cuba, and are you considering such a step now?
Well, to take the last part first, we are not considering such a step at the present time. I may say that the United States is interested, and I think that this administration is extremely interested in movements in Latin America or in Central America or the Caribbean which provide a better life for the people.